Gardaí today searched the park for clues that would lead them to the man's attackers. They say two people walking through the park found him at 1:30 this morning near the bandstand, not far from the main road. He was suffering from serious head injuries and died before he reached hospital.
Declan was killed.
This is a story that hits home pretty hard. If the death of Declan Flynn hadn't led to the changes in Ireland, someone very close to me would not be as safe today as he is, unlike when being homosexual was still illegal in Ireland. This is all down to one man that gave up his life unknowingly to make other people in future generations to be freely open to be themselves without being hurt or killed. I am not saying that it is a utopia here in Ireland for the LGBTQ+, but things have greatly improved. There is still hate crimes and there are still killings, but for most it is safer, and the people of Ireland are less tolerant to hate crimes and killings, and more open to the LGBTQ+ community than they once were. But this is about Declan Flynn and his story and the love his family had for him. And while he is an icon among the LGBTQ+ community, he was a son, brother and nephew to his family, and they still grieve him today. I will be using non-politically correct terminology, derogatory terms and words in this video. It is not to offend anyone, so please don't come after me in the comments. We are going back to the 1980s with footage, statements and terminology, and it is to show how far we have come as a society, and that the behaviour of people and attitudes are not tolerated anymore. And I think sometimes we need a little reminder. The justice system, I would say, has not been updated to where it should be. Ireland does not have any specific legislation to deal with hate crime. The only legislation in Ireland that deals with hate-based offences is the Prohibition of Incitement Hatred Act of 1989. After reading it, it covers the basics, but to me, from what I have seen, it is not implemented as it should be. It's hard to get justice for your run-of-the-mill crimes, let alone a crime against people of a minority. But I think since Declan's death, if it was to happen today, the perpetrators would get the same sentences equal to other crimes of its nature. Not that it's sufficient either way. Our custodial sentences are basically a joke. On the morning of the 10th of September 1982, Declan Flynn was found dead in Fairview Park, just north of Dublin City. This 40-acre park is noted today for its seasonal bedding displays, valuable sports fields, a children's playground, skate park, a live willow zen garden and tree-lined walks. There is also a pavilion where sometimes bands perform. But like any park under the ray of darkness, it becomes a different place, where no good can happen and a place to be avoided. Declan belonged to a family of 9 children and his dad and mam, so there was a lot of them in it. It was a very busy house with a lot of comings and goings with friends calling. Declan's sister would say it was like a train station at times. Declan was very generous and his favourite time of the year was Christmas. He worked at the airport for Aer Rianta. He was a caring person but needed a lot of care as well. He had a stammer which would get worse if he was nervous or excited about something, and it was something he struggled with all his life. As he grew older, the family realised that he had learning difficulties also. He was also left-handed and beaten by the teacher because of this, and I can attest to this as my own brother was left-handed and was beaten daily for using his left hand to write. He still writes with his left hand. When I think back to the 80s and what different authorities got away with, it makes me weak. Our parents would not interfere and they would condone it. I remember coming home from school one day after receiving 6 of the best and telling my mother. Her words to me, "Well, you must have deserved it." It makes me shudder thinking about it. Declan had challenges when it came to making new friends and was painfully shy when meeting people for the first time. He needed that extra help and his mum was more than willing to give him the attention he needed, even though she had 8 other children to attend to. She gave him the love he needed and he returned this love unconditionally. On the day Declan's body was found, he had no ID on him. His watch had been stolen and £4 out of his pocket. Back then we didn't carry ID, so the Gardaí would have had no way of identifying Declan, but to put out a bulletin on the radio and newspapers to see if anyone would come forward that recognised him by description. Declan's mother realised that he had not come home the night before, and by Monday evening she was worried as she had read in the newspaper that a body had been found in Fairview Park, which is only a 10-minute drive from them. Eventually 2 of Declan's siblings decided to go up to Blanchardstown Garda Station, and they met a guard up there, and he brought one of them in to see the body. He hardly recognised Declan as he was so beaten up. When they got home after they identified him, they told their parents, and the cries of losing a child could be heard all over the house. Even though Declan was an adult, he had a lot of childlike features, and he was a vulnerable person that needed protection. He must have been so scared and alone in his final hours. Declan's injuries consisted of a black eye very badly swollen, with a cut underneath. His nose was grazed and he had over an inch-long gash to the head behind his left ear. He actually died from inhaling his own blood. The knees of his jeans were covered in grass, meaning he was on the ground when he was being beaten. There were no defence injuries on Declan, which means he was completely overpowered and didn't have a chance to defend himself. He died a horrible death. In the 70s and 80s, Ireland was dirt poor, economically and socially depressed, and there was a significant heroin crisis. Dublin was on its second attempt at an LGBTQ community, and they had a community centre called the Hirschfield Centre. It was only 6 months old, and it was one of the few places available to men. All forms of intimacy between men was criminalised. Technically, you get 2 years in prison if you were caught holding hands or kissing in public. Protests against gay and lesbian people was very prominent in little old Catholic Ireland, and any excuse they'd come out in droves to make their feelings known. Here is a little example for you.
The occasion of this unusual protest vigil outside the RTE studios was the appearance of 2 lesbian nuns on the Late Late Show. The protesters had a statue of the Virgin Mary strapped to the roof of a caravan.
But along with these protests, there was a culture of homophobic violence that simmered under the surface of Irish society throughout the 70s and 80s. There was a never-ending amount of what we would call nowadays anti-gay hate crimes. People being beaten up and people being murdered, but it was rarely newsworthy and generally accepted by society. Just the night before Declan was killed, a man in Cork was murdered by another man in a hotel room. His defence was, "He tried to make me gay." He got 5 years for manslaughter, but only because at the time there was a media backlash for Declan's murder. Another homophobic killing was in Ballymena, County Antrim. He got a 5-year suspended sentence as the gay panic defence was used, otherwise known as the guardsman's defence. Charles Self was another man killed in his home in Monkstown in Dublin in January of that same year. He was stabbed to death. The killer has never been caught and the case remains open. This was 4 homophobic killings in 1 year. I may introduce you to a man now who is the longest running serving member of Seanad Éireann and an openly gay man, David Norris. He is pivotal in what is to be the future changing of Ireland's legislation in making homosexuality no longer illegal in Ireland. Seanad Éireann is unlike Dáil Éireann, which is the actual government of Ireland. Seanad Éireann consists of the President and Senators, which are not directly elected by the people of Ireland, but are chosen by various methods. Its powers are much weaker than the Dáil, but it can delay laws which they disagree with, rather than veto them outright. It can introduce new legislation, and this is where David Norris comes in. Unfortunately, David has known 8 people murdered through homophobic attacks in his lifetime, who he called friends, and one of those was our Declan. David told a story of Declan's work colleagues going out one night, gay spotting. Was that really a thing? This really makes me wonder about people. On this occasion, they went into a known bar called Bartley's Duns, where gay men socialised, and they spotted Declan. They teased him about it and he never went out in that area again, and that is how he ended up going out socialising in Fairview and Fairview Park, and sadly this is where he would meet his end. Detectives now are beginning to piece together Declan's last known movements on the night he died. So Sunday night the 9th of September he was in a pub in Donecarney with a friend and had met another friend just outside the Fairview Grill, and then crossed into Fairview Park. This park at the time would have been known to be a place where gay men would have gone. The only opportunities they had to negotiate desire and intimacy lurked in the shadows, and this put men like Declan at high risk of being attacked and killed. Most gay men would go to gay cruising areas like a public park or a public toilet. Declan's friends were very surprised when he was found killed in Fairview Park, as he was so shy and quiet. They didn't think he had the wherewithal to go cruising. To them, they thought he was simply on his way home, which is possible. But for whatever his reasons for being in the park that night, there was no doubt about his attacker's motivation. The Gardaí were very aware that gay men had been attacked in the park at night at that time. It had been going on for at least 6 weeks before that night. The family, when they found out about how Declan died and why, were devastated, as they did not know he was gay and his father never accepted it. But could the Gardaí have prevented this killing? The family were about to find out. The family were told by a Garda later on in the investigation that he had gone on patrol in Fairview Park the night before, and that his officer in charge had told him not to do that and to find something better to do. The family felt Declan was being stigmatised by the media. They focused on his sexuality and the seedier side of the gay scene, which took away from Declan as a person, and that he had a family who loved him and would have been accepting of him if they had known he was gay. They were more focused on that. Following the killing of Declan, the Gardaí expected to be involved in a lengthy manhunt for the killers. But within hours, 4 men aged around 18 years old and 1 child aged 14 were in custody. Robert Armstrong, aged 18, Anthony Marr, 18, who were members of the Defence Force, Patrick Kavanagh, 18, Colin Donovan, 17, and the 14-year-old who couldn't be named because he was underage. For me, if you do an adult crime, well then you should be named, but that's just me. All 5 suspects quickly confessed to the murder, and this surprised the Gardaí. They all gave a similar account of what happened on that night. They basically admitted that one of them sat on a bench as bait. The rest of them were waiting behind trees with sticks as weapons. They chased him down, beat him with the sticks on the ground to the point where Declan became unconscious, from concussion from head injuries and from bleeding. There he died from choking on his own blood from the internal injuries he suffered. As they were giving their confessions, none of them seemed concerned of the gravity of what they had done. They were very polite and very cooperative, and they made their statements with no trouble. The following statements made to Gardaí by the accused were read out in court. The gang were acting in a kind of self-confessed vigilante group. Quote, "They had wanted to clear our parks of what we call queers. They had been, in their words, queer bashing for about 6 weeks before and had battered 20 steamers. What this gang did to Declan was part of a sustained campaign against gay people in Fairview Park. Their attitude concluded that what they did was a justified activity. One journalist quoted one of the 5 saying, "They went out one night to steal a car and couldn't find one that they could break into. So instead they decided to go queer bashing. These people saw it as a leisure activity. It was something you did with your friends. It was a pleasurable way of spending an evening. It was seen as good fun." In his statement, Anthony Marr said, "We didn't mean to kill Declan. I thought he was gay and in the park to meet other gay men." To me, this was absolutely sickening. It was a violent homophobic mission that they were on. These were views and values of a homophobic nature that were deeply embedded in Irish society. They perceived that the killing of a gay man is less serious than killing a man just walking through the park on his way home. The Gardaí were aware that homophobic attacks had been going on in the parks, but their relationship with the gay community was fraught at best, especially after the investigation into the death of Charles Self. The gay community felt under investigation about their sexuality and feared being outed, as some were married men with children or high up in the corporate and social ladder. You have to remember, while these murders were being investigated, homosexuality was still illegal in Ireland, and so the gay community were not forthcoming in giving information or reporting incidents. The Gardaí were not trained in how to deal with the gay community and had no understanding of people's lifestyles in this area. So to me, the Gardaí's hands were tied through ignorance and law. But the gay community before Declan's murder had actually started collecting evidence themselves. They had got information that a gang had been active up in Fairview Park, and one of the members of an activist group started shadowing the gang. He got their names, addresses, and handed it over to the Gardaí in Clontarf in Dublin, and nothing was done. When at one stage he went up to the Garda station, he insisted on trying to get them to take it seriously. They threatened to have him arrested. Well, that's helpful. David Norris said while some Garda stations were very good at dealing with reports of crime against gay people, other stations were absolutely appalling. When the 5 were arrested and charged, the family of Declan felt that justice would be done, and even though Declan was gay, the fact that he was an innocent man, murdered by 5 people that had confessed, all would be sorted. How wrong they would be. What they didn't realise was the judicial system would be as corrupt and out of date as the Garda Síochána. The justice system was influenced by the atmosphere and the values of society. The law on murder and manslaughter hasn't really changed, or the law on sentencing, but our values as a society have changed. This is very important when you hear what happened to the 5 people charged with Declan's murder in the 80s, compared to if it happened today. Ireland's social values came to bear on the trial when Declan's killers offered a plea. They were all initially charged with murder, but 4 of them pleaded guilty to manslaughter. They admitted to attacking Declan but claimed they didn't mean to kill him. To me, if you decide one night to go out and beat the crap out of a man, and it's 5-1, there is good reasoning to have in your mind, we could kill this man by our actions. So this to me is total bull. The DPP accepted this plea. What an absolute joke. This meant the 4 of the 5 suspects would now not face a murder trial. At the time when one couldn't be sure that a jury of 12 people would take seriously a murder charge against somebody who killed a man in a known cruising area for gay men, when homosexual acts were against the law. The DPP were concerned if it went to a full murder trial that the jury might acquit them, and that would have been an extremely bad outcome. So only one of them, the youngest at 14, went on trial for murder. This to me was tactical also, as he was underage, seen as a child, and he claimed he had only hit Declan with a stick in the buttocks. Pretty harmless, don't you think? I'm saving my give me strength moment for later. Forensically, they could tie the sticks to the beatings, but they couldn't tie the perpetrators to the sticks, as DNA wasn't developed at the time. This made the case against the 14-year-old very weak. They had to go on what he and the others admitted to, which wasn't much. Before the jury could consider the evidence of the 14-year-old, Judge Gannon intervened. He withdrew the murder charge from the jury, which is something the trial judge can do. It is part of the function of a trial judge to withdraw a charge from the jury if he or she feels that there's insufficient evidence. The judge dropped the charges down to a lower consideration of manslaughter. The 14-year-old and along with the other 4 were found guilty of manslaughter. On the day of sentencing, Declan's family were all there. All 5 were sentenced at the same time. One of the defendants appeared in his Air Corps uniform. Tactics again, of course. There was no shortage of support in the courtroom for the defendants. They had priests giving character references. They had the defendants vindicating their behaviour by positioning themselves and declaring themselves anti-gay vigilantes. And that went unchallenged in the court. All 5 were guilty of manslaughter and could spend a lengthy time in prison. In Irish standards, that is, as we all know now, compared to other countries, not a long time even for murder convictions. As sentencing for manslaughter, a judge has a wide scope on the length of time someone can be put behind bars, anything up to life in prison. But I think we all know that's not going to happen. But what was to happen next would double down on the pure horror of what had already happened. Justice Gannon at the sentencing stage made several statements saying, "This was a terrible crime. It was one of the saddest and most tragic cases ever to come before his court." But then he wasn't long changing his tune and directed his next statements towards Declan's killers. He said they came from good families, that they probably had a low risk of reoffending, that they'd learnt their lesson. We're all entitled to our prejudice and biases, but we're not entitled to express them through violence. These words were the ultimate insult to Declan's family, his parents and to Declan. Justice Gannon passed various lengths of sentencing up to 5 years to all 5 and suspended every one of them. Oh, give me strength. The family and the people of the community were outraged, especially Senator David Norris, who said Justice Gannon just gave people a license to kill gay people. The gay community were not surprised with the sentencing, but it showed them there needed to be change, and it was a call to action for their community and to change the minds of the Irish people and make them realise that this was unacceptable and no more. The sentencing at the time caused a public outcry. There were several debates in the Dáil where Justice Gannon was criticised. They urged Minister for Justice to call on Justice Gannon for his resignation. Note, when Justice Gannon was handing down the suspended sentence to the 5, he expressed his view that Declan's killers were unlikely to offend again. This would not be so for Robert Armstrong. He would be wrong. Robert Armstrong would go on to rape a pregnant woman. He gave her a choice, either have sex with him or he'd kick her in the stomach. Absolutely horrific for the poor woman. Can you just imagine? He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. It's hard not to think that if Justice Gannon had passed down the proper sentences for the killing of Declan, this woman would never have gone through what she did. Justice Gannon also was not averse to handing down custodial sentences, even for minor crimes. Shortly after the trial, he passed down a sentence to someone who stole a handbag, and they got 2 years. The Gardaí were also under scrutiny, and an internal inquiry was conducted into why nothing had been done to stop the attacks in Fairview Park, and we all know where this is going. Declan's brother would say that the Garda inquiry consisted of his father and brother being called down to Fitzgibbon Street Garda Station and being interviewed by a Garda who had his gun visible, and being asked what journalists they had been talking to. They had no interest in finding out why nothing was done in Fairview Park to stop the beatings. Meanwhile, in the killers' community, celebrations were held to mark the outcome of their trials and welcome them home. They lit bonfires and had drinks all around to celebrate getting off with the killing of Declan. It was one outrage after another for Declan's family and the gay community. The gay community felt on their own and Ireland had failed them. There was a lot of anger among the gay community, and the leaders tried to temper that as they didn't want to provoke the local community. So the focus was really on a protest against violence, against gay people and women, as they, in their eyes, were victimised by the justice system. Remember, women were seen as second-class citizens in those days also, and they were good enough to include us in their cause, and I personally want to thank them for that. Instead of going to the usual sites, they made their way down to Fairview Park and had a gathering at where Declan was murdered. There had been a victory march by the perpetrators in Fairview Park also, and the local community had supported that. This is really making my stomach sick. The protest that the gay community organised was to tell the community that this is not acceptable. It was about reclaiming the streets. They didn't feel welcome and they felt very vulnerable and unprotected. They had no statutory protection, and being out on the streets advocating and making noise, they didn't feel any different. What made it special was the scale of it. It was the first time they were joined in protest by their straight allies. Student union groups, radical left-field political parties, civil liberty groups all joined them. This was so important to the gay community that people were with them and they did accept them. They wanted to stand with them and they were not alone in this protest against violence. This was a peaceful march and they were met with open public support. This was to mark a new type of mass visibility to the gay community. It not only was a reaction to an injustice, but the beginning of change. This makes my heart sing. Declan's killing helped gay rights become a national issue. Campaigners hoped to force a challenge in the law and legalise homosexuality. This fight was led by Senator David Norris. First, they had to get rid of the legislation that made homosexual acts a criminal offence, and then put into place a legislation that was strong and positive for gay people. David approached it through the fact we were still using British imperial statutes, which had never been discussed. It was an infringement to a person's right to privacy. He put together tactics in order to get the different political parties on side. For example, he approached Fianna Fáil and said, "You call yourself a Republican Party. How can you possibly support a British imperial statute?" Senator David Norris brought his challenge to the Constitution all the way to Ireland's highest, most powerful court, and they lost. But Senator David Norris did not give up. He and his supporters brought their fight to the European Court of Human Rights, and in 1988 they finally won. But for some back home it sparked outrage. Sorry, I had to put this in for the Irish people who are familiar with the host Gay Byrne. Many a night as a child I spent sitting on the floor at my father's feet, watching the Late Late Show, although I think I missed this episode, as we only had 2 channels in the whole country.
It's not normal for a man to be preoccupied with another man's back passage. And let's face it, this is what the Homosexual Male Act is about.
I mean, that's ridiculous. That's quite insulting. Like, I mean,
I suppose the quick answer is, what about men who are besotted with women's front passages? Is the quick answer there?
The debate raged on for 5 years until 1993, over 10 years after Declan's killing. Homosexuality was finally legalised. Finally, Ireland was moving with the times. Gone were the times you could be refused service in a shop, a hotel, your boyfriend or girlfriend could be refused hospital visiting rights, when their partners were dying of AIDS and denied any form of family status. This was all rectified. In 2018, on the 25th anniversary of decriminalisation, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, himself a gay man, made an official apology to all who suffered under Ireland's anti-gay legislation. The government also hosted a state reception in Dublin Castle to mark the anniversary. But unfortunately there is still discrimination against the gay community in Ireland, and murders and beatings, and this makes my heart sore. In 2022, 2 gay men, Aidan Moffat, 41, and Michael Snee, 58, both living in Sligo, were murdered 24 hours apart in what was a homophobic attack. The murderer set up dates with these 2 men through a dating app, went to their home and killed them. He also was charged with attacking another man who ended up losing an eye after the attack. He is currently on remand and receiving a psychiatric evaluation. I can already see where this is going, but I hope I'm wrong. The Irish attitude is not the same from when Declan was killed in 1982. The people of Ireland no longer see it as acceptable in society or acceptable in statutory Ireland, which is the most important. The gay community are afforded a level of protection now, and the Gardaí and the courts are better educated in how to deal with hate crimes. I will leave you with Declan's brother's words.
I would like people to remember that he was our brother, and he was a warm, giving human being. We need to keep ownership of that, because we're still mourning the fact that he's no longer with us.